Most crimes don't fail because of brilliant police work. They fail because someone couldn't stop talking. They talk to friends. They talk to strangers. They talk online. Sometimes they even talk to the police, voluntarily. And every time they believe the same thing, that they're smarter than everyone else in the room. Here's the uncomfortable question. If committing the crime was the hard part, why did it all fall apart because of one sentence? Why do so many cases collapse, not during the act itself, but afterward, during the bragging, the explaining, the oversharing? Somewhere out there, a crime almost worked, until someone needed recognition, until someone wanted credit, until someone decided silence felt worse than risk. That's the secondary problem no one talks about. Because these criminals weren't reckless in the way movies portray, they planned, they calculated, they thought ahead. What they didn't plan for was themselves, their ego, their confidence, their need to feel impressive. A joke told to the wrong person, a post shared a little too proudly, a detail offered that no one asked for. And suddenly, the case writes itself. Today, we're opening the file on the strangest and most absurd experiments humanity has ever attempted. Not experiments in crime, but experiments in self-control. Because in these stories, the police didn't chase suspects. Suspects walked straight toward them. Fasten your seatbelts. Logic is about to die a spectacular death. Fact 1. When the confession was just small talk. A man committed a burglary that went unnoticed. No alarms, no witnesses, no immediate leads. It almost worked. Days later, at a bar, he casually mentioned a weird house with a loose back window to someone he had just met. He wasn't confessing, he was storytelling, adding color, showing he had a good eye for details. The listener happened to live on that street. Police didn't extract the confession, they received it, pre-packaged. The detail about the window matched a report that hadn't been public. The mistake wasn't the crime. It was assuming casual conversation doesn't count as evidence. Fact 2. When bragging became a timeline. A group planned a theft carefully. Masks, timing, no phones at the scene. Afterward, one of them couldn't resist posting about it online. Not the crime, just the vibe. A photo, a caption, a timestamp, enough to establish presence. Friends commented, jokes were made. The post stayed up. Investigators didn't need a suspect, they needed a clock. The crime didn't expose them, the need for recognition did. Fact 3. When calling the police felt like control. After committing a hit and run, a driver called the police to report an accident. He believed that getting ahead of the story meant controlling it. He talked too much, offered details that hadn't been asked for, corrected himself mid-sentence. The call was recorded. Investigators noticed the timeline didn't align with any reported collision. The story wasn't inconsistent, it was too detailed. The mistake wasn't calling for help. It was believing narration equals control. Fact 4. When the joke was too specific. A suspect joked to coworkers about a crime reported on the news that morning. He mocked how obvious the mistake was, a mistake only the perpetrator would know. The room laughed. Someone remembered. Police didn't arrest him for the joke. They questioned him because of the detail inside it. Humor felt safe. Specificity wasn't. The crime didn't catch him. Precision did. Fact 5. When explaining too much became the problem. During questioning, a suspect was asked a simple yes or no question. He answered with a story. He filled silence with context. He anticipated follow-up questions. He clarified things no one challenged. Investigators didn't interrupt. They let him keep going. The contradiction wasn't obvious until later, when the transcript showed he'd answered questions that were never asked. The law didn't force him to talk. His confidence did. Fact 6. When the story was better than the plan. A man pulled off a small fraud that went unnoticed for weeks. No alerts, no follow-up. Then he told the story at a party. Not as a confession, as a performance. He framed it as a clever workaround, a harmless hack, something only a smart person would think of. Someone recorded the conversation, not for the crime, for the story. Investigators later noticed the timeline matched an unresolved case. The language used mirrored internal documents that had never been released. The fraud wasn't discovered. The storytelling was. Fact 7. When texts became testimony. 2 accomplices agreed on one rule: no talking after the job. They broke it immediately. Jokes turned into details. Details turned into explanations. Explanations turned into reassurance, all in text messages they assumed would never be read. Phones get lost, accounts get accessed, screenshots last longer than memory. Police didn't need informants, they needed chat logs. The crime stayed quiet, the conversation didn't. Fact 8. When off the record meant nothing. During a casual interview, a suspect asked if they could speak off the record. They assumed the phrase had legal weight. It didn't. They relaxed, they joked, they filled silence with context they believed wouldn't matter. The recording never stopped. What caught attention wasn't a confession, it was the shift in tone, from careful to confident, and the details that followed. The mistake wasn't trusting the process, it was trusting a phrase they misunderstood. Fact 9. When correcting the story, gave it away. A suspect noticed a small error in a news report and corrected it, publicly. The correction was accurate, too accurate. Police hadn't released that information. Only the person involved would know it needed correcting. The comments stayed online long enough to be archived. The crime didn't reveal them. The urge to be right did. Fact 10. When confidence sounded like experience. During questioning, a suspect spoke with unusual certainty about procedures, timelines, and outcomes. They weren't guessing, they were recalling. Investigators noticed the difference between speculation and familiarity. The language wasn't defensive, it was instructional. They hadn't planned to arrest anyone that day, they planned to listen. The crime required skill, the mistake required ego. Fact 11. When a receipt told the story. A man committed a robbery with gloves, a mask, and a clean escape route. On the way home, he stopped for snacks. He paid with a card. The receipt timestamp matched the window of the crime. He didn't think a convenience store mattered. He didn't think 5 minutes mattered. Investigators didn't find him at the scene. They found him buying chips nearby. The crime was careful. The routine wasn't. Fact 12. When the search history was too honest. A suspect believed private browsing meant invisible browsing. Before committing the crime, they searched for methods, timelines, and how long until police stopped looking. They closed the tab and felt safe. Browsers forget, servers don't. Investigators didn't need a confession, they needed context. The crime wasn't discovered through force, it was discovered through curiosity left unfiltered. Fact 13. When a small detail became a signature. A criminal reused the same phrase in multiple situations, texts, posts, and conversations. They thought it was harmless, just a habit, just personality. Investigators noticed repetition. The phrase appeared near multiple incidents across different locations. Patterns don't look suspicious to the person creating them. They look obvious to everyone else. The mistake wasn't repetition. It was assuming no one was paying attention. Fact 14. When the alibi was too perfect. A suspect had an alibi ready. Times, places, witnesses. It was flawless and identical every time it was told. Investigators didn't doubt it because it was weak. They doubted it because it never changed. Real memory drifts. Scripts don't. The crime didn't unravel under pressure. It unraveled under consistency. Fact 15. When the camera was assumed to be off, a criminal believed a security camera wasn't working because no one had fixed it in years. They were half right. The camera wasn't monitored live. It was still recording. Investigators didn't watch footage in real time. They watched it later. The crime wasn't seen when it happened. it was saved. Fact 16. When reporting, it first felt like safety. After committing insurance fraud, a man called authorities to report suspicious activity. He believed being first meant being trusted. He talked freely, explained motives no one asked about, clarified details that hadn't been mentioned publicly. The call created a baseline. Every later statement drifted from it. Investigators didn't accuse him, they compared versions. The mistake wasn't calling, it was assuming first contact equals credibility. Fact 17. When the witness was too helpful. A suspect volunteered to be a witness in a case he caused. He walked officers through the scene with confidence. He corrected minor errors. He suggested timelines. Real witnesses hesitate. They forget. They ask questions. He didn't. Investigators didn't arrest him that day. They took notes. The crime didn't give him away. Familiarity did. Fact 18. When the tip came with extra details. Someone anonymously tipped police about a crime, then added context. They described emotions, reactions, motives, details only someone involved would know. Anonymous tips usually lack texture. This one had personality. Investigators didn't trace the call immediately. They waited for the same voice to appear again. It did. The tip wasn't anonymous. It was distinctive. Fact 19. When confidence turned into evidence. During questioning, a suspect kept reassuring officers he understood how these things work. He explained procedure, anticipated next steps, spoke as if he'd done this before. Experience has a sound. So does rehearsal. Investigators noticed the overlap. The crime didn't reveal expertise. The language did. Fact 20. When trying to control the story, created one. A suspect asked to clear things up before police contacted anyone else. He framed the narrative, set context, provided explanations. Later, when new information surfaced, his version couldn't stretch to fit it. Stories that are true adjust naturally. Stories designed for control don't. The mistake wasn't lying, it was thinking a story could stay frozen. Fact 21. When a misspelled word gave it away. A suspect wrote a note related to the crime. Short, casual, confident. There was one problem. A word was misspelled. The same way every time. The same error appeared in messages, posts, and a handwritten draft found later. Misspellings feel random. Patterns don't. Investigators didn't care about grammar. They cared about consistency. The crime didn't connect itself. The habit did. Fact 22. When a GPS glitch wasn't. A criminal believed location tracking had failed. The phone showed no movement during the crime window. What they didn't realize was that GPS gaps still leave trails. Wi-Fi pings, cell towers, background data. Investigators didn't need exact coordinates. They needed overlap. The device didn't betray them. The assumption did. Fact 23. When the joke landed too close to home. After a crime went public, a suspect joked about it online. Not bragging, not confessing, just humor. The joke referenced a detail that hadn't been released yet. No one laughed. Someone saved it. Police didn't arrest him for the joke. They questioned him because of what the joke included. The humor wasn't the issue. The timing was. Fact 24. When the clothes never changed. A suspect was careful about everything except what they wore afterward. The same jacket, the same shoes, the same routine. Cameras didn't catch the crime clearly. They caught what came after. Investigators didn't match faces. They matched habits. The mistake wasn't fashion. It was predictability. Fact 25. When a tiny correction broke the story. A suspect corrected an officer on a minor detail, not defensively, casually. The correction implied knowledge of sequence, what happened before and after, information not publicly known. The room went quiet. The crime didn't collapse dramatically. It simply had nowhere left to go. The mistake wasn't arrogance. It was assuming small things stay small. Fact 26. when thinking you're special became the mistake. A suspect believed investigators wouldn't look at him because he didn't fit the profile. He was educated, calm, articulate. He spoke confidently, used the right words. Assumed intelligence created distance. It didn't. Investigators don't eliminate people for sounding smart. They listen more closely. The crime didn't rely on stereotypes. The suspect did. Fact 27. When experience turned into overconfidence. A repeat offender believed past success meant future safety. He reused methods, repeated language, followed routines that had worked before. Experience felt like protection. It was actually a pattern. Investigators didn't chase innovation. They waited for familiarity. The mistake wasn't repetition. It was assuming repetition wouldn't be noticed. Fact 28. When explaining the system exposed you. During questioning, a suspect explained how these cases usually go. He described timelines, procedures, outcomes. He wasn't guessing. He was narrating from inside the system. Investigators noticed the fluency. The crime didn't require expertise. The explanation revealed it. Fact 29. When mocking the police backfired. A suspect joked publicly about how clueless investigators were. The joke contained assumptions about what police knew and what they didn't. The assumptions were wrong. Investigators didn't react to the insult. They reacted to the insight behind it. The mockery wasn't the problem. The familiarity was. Fact 30. When believing you're in control made you talk. A suspect believed silence made him look guilty, so he kept talking. He clarified, he justified, he corrected. Control felt like explanation. Explanation felt like safety. Investigators didn't interrupt. They let control run its course. The crime didn't need pressure. The ego did the work. Fact 31. When oversharing felt like honesty. A suspect believed transparency made him look innocent. He shared extra context, added background, offered explanations before anyone asked. He thought openness built trust. What it actually built was a timeline, one that grew longer and more detailed with every sentence. Investigators didn't question his honesty. They questioned why so much of it was volunteered. The crime didn't expose him. The overflow did. Fact 32. When just venting became evidence. After committing a crime, a suspect vented online. Not bragging, not confessing, just frustration. But emotions leave fingerprints. The anger pointed somewhere specific. The timing lined up too cleanly. Investigators didn't need admissions. They needed motive shaped by emotion. The post wasn't illegal. The context made it relevant. Fact 33. When trusting friends felt safe. A criminal talked freely around friends, assuming loyalty meant silence. Someone repeated the story casually. Another filled in gaps. The version changed slightly each time. Eventually, one version reached someone who didn't belong in the circle. Police didn't hear the original story. They heard the echoes. The crime stayed contained. The narrative didn't. Fact 34. When assuming they can't prove it, failed. A suspect believed that without physical evidence, words didn't matter. He spoke loosely, speculated aloud, hypothesized outcomes. Investigators weren't looking for proof yet. They were looking for direction. Words don't convict, they point. The crime wasn't proven by speech. It was guided by it. Fact 35. When filling, silence felt necessary. During questioning, silence felt unbearable, so the suspect talked. Not lies, just thoughts, possibilities, clarifications. Investigators didn't push, they waited. Silence is neutral. Speech isn't. The mistake wasn't saying something wrong. It was saying anything at all. Fact 36. When talking felt like relief. After the crime, a suspect felt pressure building. Silence was heavy. Talking felt like release, so he talked. Not to police, to anyone who would listen. He framed it as stress, as frustration, as needing to get it off his chest. Relief came first. Consequences came later. The crime didn't force a confession. Discomfort did. Fact 37. When being heard mattered more than being safe. A suspect wanted acknowledgement, someone to understand how complicated things had been. He explained motives, circumstances, justifications. Investigators later noticed something simple. Innocent people talk about what happened to them. He talked about what he did. The need to be understood outweighed the need to stay quiet. The crime stayed hidden. The narrative surfaced it. Fact 38. When silence was misread as weakness. A suspect believed staying quiet made him look guilty, so he filled the space. He corrected assumptions, clarified timelines, offered hypotheticals. Investigators didn't interpret silence as guilt. They interpreted speech as direction. The mistake wasn't fear. It was misreading how silence works. Fact 39. When the system didn't need to push. Investigators didn't threaten. They didn't rush. They didn't pressure. They waited. People who believe they're smarter than the system eventually try to prove it with words. The system didn't extract information. It received it. The crime didn't require force to solve. Time did the work. Fact 40. When the final move was self-initiated. In the end, no dramatic arrest happened. The suspect volunteered information, asked to clarify, wanted to make sure everything was understood. That was the final step. The system didn't close in. He stepped forward. The final absurdity isn't that criminals talk. It's that they believe talking makes them safer. Fact 41. When trying to look cooperative went too far. A suspect believed cooperation meant safety, so he offered help, suggested angles, explained what investigators should focus on before they asked. The intention was alignment. The effect was exposure. Real cooperation responds. He preempted. Investigators didn't see goodwill. They saw ownership of the narrative. The crime didn't require pressure. It required patience. Fact 42. When a follow-up message sealed it. After an interview, a suspect felt uneasy. Something didn't feel resolved. So he sent a follow-up message, clarifying a detail, adding context, fixing wording. The correction contradicted the original statement. Investigators didn't need confrontation. They needed version 1 and version 2. The mistake wasn't inconsistency. It was trying to clean it up. Fact 43. When saying hypothetically didn't help a suspect, framed everything as theory. Hypothetically, if someone did this, in a scenario like that, the scenarios were specific, too specific. Investigators didn't care about the disclaimer, they cared about the accuracy. The word hypothetically didn't create distance, it removed doubt. Fact 44. When the need to win the argument lost the case. A suspect argued with investigators, not angrily, but intellectually. He corrected logic, challenged assumptions, tried to prove he was smarter. He was convincing, too convincing. In trying to win the discussion, he revealed how deeply he understood the situation. The crime didn't expose intelligence. The argument did. Fact 45. When the final error was wanting closure. In the end, the suspect just wanted it to be over. He asked to explain one last thing, to clarify, to make sure there were no misunderstandings. That explanation completed the picture. The system didn't push. It waited for the moment someone needed closure more than silence. The final absurdity isn't that criminals talk too much. It's that they believe the last word will save them. So far, none of these crimes collapsed because of brilliant investigations or dramatic breakthroughs. There were no last-minute chases, no genius deductions, no cinematic twists. What we saw instead was repetition, people talking when silence would have worked, explaining when nothing needed explaining, correcting details no one questioned. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. The crime itself was often planned carefully. The mistake came afterward, when control shifted from action to ego, when the need to feel clever, understood, or impressive quietly overpowered the instinct to stop. What connects all of these cases isn't stupidity in the obvious sense. It's confidence without restraint. Confidence that said, I can handle this. Confidence that said, I know how this works. Confidence that said, one more sentence won't hurt. And every time, it did. These people weren't caught because they were reckless criminals. They were caught because they believed they were exceptions, smarter, calmer, more in control than everyone else who'd failed before them. They underestimated one thing consistently: themselves. Not their planning, not their preparation, but their inability to leave things alone once the moment passed. Silence felt empty. Talking felt productive. And the system quietly waited for that instinct to kick in. Because systems don't need perfection. They only need time, and someone willing to fill it with words. If there's anything unsettling here, it's not how these cases ended. It's how familiar the behavior feels. Because self-sabotage doesn't start with a mistake. It starts with the belief that you're immune to making one. Maybe stupidity isn't the opposite of intelligence. It's what happens when intelligence forgets to stop. Because none of these cases ended the way movies promise. There was no dramatic takedown, no brilliant trap, no moment where the system suddenly outsmarted the criminal. What happened was quieter. Someone talked, then talked a little more, then talked past the point where anything could be taken back. That's the part people misunderstand. The danger wasn't the crime itself. It was what came after, when adrenaline faded and ego stepped in. Because silence feels passive, talking feels like control, and control feels comforting when consequences are still abstract. People convince themselves that if they keep explaining, narrating, shaping the story, they can stay ahead of it. They can't. We always reach for the impossible, but sometimes it's because no one stopped to ask if we should. No one stopped to ask whether one more sentence was necessary. No one stopped to ask whether being understood mattered more than being safe. No one stopped to ask whether confidence was actually helping or just making noise. And the system doesn't interrupt that process. It waits. Because systems don't rely on force as much as we think. They rely on patterns, on repetition, on the certainty that people who believe they're in control eventually try to prove it, with words. That's why so many crimes don't end in confrontation. They end in clarification, in corrections, in someone volunteering context no one demanded. Not because they were forced to, but because they believed it was smart. The real absurdity isn't that criminals make mistakes. Everyone does. The absurdity is how often those mistakes come from the same place, the belief that silence is weakness and speech is power. In reality, it's usually the opposite. Silence doesn't create evidence. Talking does. And once the words are out, the system doesn't need to chase anyone. It just listens. It lets timelines form. It lets contradictions appear. It lets people explain themselves into a corner. If there's a lesson here, it's not about crime. It's about restraint, about knowing when to stop, about understanding that not every moment needs to be filled, about recognizing that confidence, unchecked, can be as dangerous as fear. Because in many systems, legal or otherwise, the most effective mechanism isn't surveillance or authority. It's human nature. This has been the Absurdist Files, where logic takes a vacation and reality writes the jokes. And in these cases, reality